Welcome, everyone, to the World Gastroenterology Organization Climate Course for Global Gastroenterology. Today, we're going to be discussing Session 5, which is Understanding the Carbon Footprint of GI Care. My name is Rabia de Latour. I'm going to be the chair for today's event. We have some wonderful speakers and as well as some wonderful moderators. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce not only our moderators and speakers, but also the topics they're going to be talking about today. So first up, we have Dr. Alejandro Piscoya. Professor Piscoya is the chief gastroenterologist at the hospital Guilherme de la Fuente in Lima, Peru. He serves as the president of the Sociedad de Gastroenterología del Peru, and later in 2023 will take over as a president of the Pan American Gastroenterological Association. He's also the chair of the WGO's Global Guidelines Committee. Next up, for our second moderator, we have Dr. Raja Affendi Raja Ali. Professor Affendi is affiliated with the National University of Malaysia, the UKM Medical Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He is the immediate past president of the Malaysia Society of Gastroenterology and Hepatology and serves on the WGO's Clinical Research Committee. For our speakers today, we have two wonderful speakers, Dr. Hayee and Dr. Heiko Pohl. Dr. Hayee will be talking about the carbon footprint of endoscopy care, and Dr. Pohl will be talking about the carbon footprint of non-endoscopy digestive care. So Dr. Hayee is a consultant gastroenterologist at King's College Hospital in the UK and has been chief of service since 2015. He trained at Guy's Hospital, KT Medical School, graduating in 1999, and was appointed a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in 2015. Dr. Hayee has written and presented extensively on the environmental footprint of endoscopy. I myself have had the pleasure of presenting with him on multiple occasions. He's just absolutely wonderful, so you're in for a treat, particularly as a climate change leader in the British Society of Gastroenterology and the European Society for Gastrointestinal Endoscopy. Dr. Heiko Pohl is affiliated with the Dartmouth Geisel School of Medicine, as well as the White River Junction VA Medical Center in the US. He was a lead author of the 2022 Multi-Society Strategic Plan on Environmental Sustainability, which reported on the Joint Strategic Climate Plan of the AASLD, ACG, AGA, and ASGE. He has a particular interest in measuring the amount of waste generated during endoscopic procedures and to understand the impact on waste of changing from reusable to single-use endoscopes. And last but not least, my name is Rabia de Latour. I'm the director of endoscopy at Bellevue Hospital Center in New York City. I'm also the chief sustainability officer, and I'm an assistant professor of medicine at New York University School of Medicine. So thank you so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to some wonderful talks.
Hello, I'm Hayee. I'm a consultant gastroenterologist from King's College Hospital in London. It's my great pleasure to talk to you about the carbon footprint endoscopy. Some disclosures for me. None of these are relevant to the presentation I'm about to give. I also might mention one or two companies or products in the process of this presentation, and I'm in no way endorsing them or supporting their use. To start, the background is that endoscopy is the third highest generator of waste in healthcare, and that's plastic waste. There's good reasons for that. We have thousands and thousands of cases every year in the average endoscopy unit. The consumables and equipment that we use is non-renewable in large part, or at least we think it is. The decontamination of our equipment is resource heavy. And we ask our patients to come backwards and forwards to the hospital several times during the course of their pathway. It's been estimated that each endoscopy then generates around 2 kilograms of disposable waste, and that's per endoscopy. The vast majority of this goes to landfill, so could potentially be recycled if treated properly. The remaining 28 and 9% represent biohazard waste and recycled waste that's already sent for processing. This schematic is from the NHS England Net Zero initiative, the white paper that was released in October 2020, and it shows the breakdown writ large of an organization, a healthcare organization, but it could be used as an aide memoir to guide how we think about any process in healthcare, including endoscopy. And it's important to see that the majority of carbon emissions here in this pie chart come from things that happen outside of the hospital. We started a movement in 2020 called Green Endoscopy, and it's grown significantly and organically since then. I'm very pleased to be part of it. We've been educating and advocating for sustainable approaches in our specialty for the last couple of years, and we were given an early position paper in the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology. But since then, we've had a number of successes in the world literature and contributing to the knowledge base that we need going forward. We're also seeing that the national societies and international societies are taking note, and this is part of the presentation that I'm giving today. At grassroots and at ground level, we are reviewing what we do. We can review what we do. We can make small changes in our own endoscopy units. There are researchers across the world, as I mentioned today, generating data that we need to guide our steps in the sustainability path. And then, more importantly, we need to reinvent ourselves. We need to change how we operate and how we behave with a view to sustainability and climate change. The British Society of Gastroenterology released these consensus guidelines on practical measures for sustainability for endoscopy, and I would commend that to you. Let's break it down, though. In terms of the actual carbon footprint of endoscopy, we can start by looking at how much power we use, electricity. And this was done by Guilherme, who many of you will know, just looking at the quoted energy consumption per year for the equipment that we use, the computers, the anesthesia machines, the washers, the scopes themselves, and lighting in the average endoscopy unit. And making some assumptions about how many procedures are done in the average endoscopy unit per day, we figured that the electricity used for one endoscopy is equivalent to around 5 miles driven in the average passenger car. But electricity is just one part of what we do. We need more accurate data and more research to really pin down the footprint of endoscopy. And this diagram is from the BSG consensus statements, which are available as free online free to view, showing you really the complexity of what we're looking at when we say what is the carbon footprint of endoscopy. We've got to take into account all of these things. Really, if we think about it, it doesn't just end and begin and end in what we're doing inside the endoscopy room. But where are the quick wins? What can we do in terms of our move to be more sustainable? Where are the places that we incur the worst carbon footprints that we can do something about? Well, here are some tips and schematics, and I'll go through these with you in some detail now. But looking at paper, our use of plastic and water, and also let's not forget that we're asking patients to travel backwards and forwards. We take time, and we use buildings that could be made more sustainable as well. We could also partner with industry, and here I'm looking at the tail wagging the dog. I don't know if we're the tail and the industry is the dog, or it's the other way around. But anyway, you've heard around the world where the supermarkets were phasing out plastic carrier bags and plastic straws. They were doing that because the consumers were asking of them. So we can hold people to account. Healthcare is a strong advocate for procurement, and our pockets are deep. So money talks, essentially. We can ask our manufacturers and our partners to do better. And we also ought to have a proper discussion about single-use equipment as well while we're here. In terms of water, let's focus on that for a second. Well, decontamination, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, uses somewhere around 50 to 80 liters of water per cycle per scope. That's 20 or 30 liters for a manual wash, and 20 to 50 liters in the average automated endoscope reprocessor, depending on which manufacturer you use. It's fair to say that the more modern AERs have reduced this to around 20, 23, 24 litres per cycle, but it's also worth noting that this is water that's been created by reverse osmosis in many cases, and this is a really carbon or energy intensive way of purifying water. We do that on site in most decontamination units. So we spend a great deal of effort and carbon to ensure that water is pure. Can we do it differently? We could use ultrafiltration units in smaller units. We could use inline tap filters. And it's been said again and again that we put sterile water into parts of the body where it seems to be where it would seem unnecessary. That water often comes in plastic containers that have been shipped from the manufacturing plants around the world to our unit. We could change that. So that's part of the water governance principles that are set out in the BSG guidance, looking at recommendations to help guide people towards using water more sustainably in the endoscopy unit and outside. Next, about plastic waste. Many of us would regard plastic waste as unavoidable, but in fact, that's probably not true. In fact, demonstrably not true, because what you can see here is the average endoscopy day, a couple of plastic bags here full of orange waste. But we could switch it to this. Much of the stuff that we're throwing away into orange bags, which is incinerated, we could be diverting to recycling safely. It's estimated that we could save the average surgical theatre, at least, could save around a ton of carbon dioxide per year if they just divided waste up into recyclable and non-recyclable streams. This schematic is from that study that mentions a cost to this. In the orange side, this is contaminated waste that we need to throw in the orange bag and be incinerated. That costs, these are 2010 prices in the UK. So for 2022, you can basically double that, £700 a tonne for infected or contaminated waste, and around £70 a tonne for waste that could be domestic or recyclable. There's a way of highlighting this in terms of the incineration process itself. If you incinerate healthcare waste, every tonne generates around a tonne of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So 1,000 kilograms generates 1,000 kilograms. But if you can recycle that waste, you pretty much abrogate all of those emissions, which is worth doing. So get the right waste baskets into your units. It's an easy win to have that. They don't cost very much at all. In some cases, the hospital will front the bill for you. And it's a great way of activating staff to start being more green. So if we suggest that the figures that I showed you at the top of this presentation, 64% of that 2.1 kilograms of plastic waste was potentially going to landfill and could be recycled. That equates to, if we say 18 million endoscopies in the US, let's say every year, that's a rough estimate, that equates to around 24 tons of potentially recyclable plastic waste that is otherwise either going to landfill or being incinerated. And that's a whole lot of CO2 that we could be removing from the chain. Next up is paper. We use a lot of paper in our processes. This pie chart, this rather comical pie chart, is meant to represent the amount of paper that was coming from recycled sources in the NHS pre-2021. The vast majority was not recycled. That's around 3.5 million reams of virgin paper every year, equating to around 29 tons of CO2 or 25 million miles in a car. But we have switched, and the resources and the savings that we've made have been considerable, not just in CO2 emissions, but also in the wood that we're using, the raw materials, and the water as well. So it's well worth switching to recycled paper if you can, and in many ways it's cheaper. So things to consider: do you need to print one report? Do you need to incinerate waste if it's confidential? Sure, it has to be treated, but doesn't need to be incinerated. And sending emails is often lauded as the alternative to paper, but emails are not carbon neutral. A regular email will incur around 4 grams of CO2, which is fine, but an email with large attachments up to a gigabyte could be up to 50 grams of CO2, which is more than sending a letter. In terms of consumables, well, it's difficult to accurately cost these without help from industry, because the production of consumables is commercially sensitive, but partnerships are being created. This is Robin Badley, our fellow in sustainable endoscopy, literally weighing and breaking down consumables into their constituent parts to analyze them and to try and estimate the carbon footprint of a snare or a biopsy forceps. But those partnerships are being created and we are making headway. And also, we have to take into account the transport of those consumables from the manufacturers to our endoscopy units. We have to know about the way they're manufactured and what the carbon footprint of those factories looks like. But I'm really pleased to say that companies are taking note. They are understanding that we need this from them. And there's a couple of examples here, not promoting these in any way, but just to show you that change can happen and it can be driven by healthcare upwards. Looking at biopsies next, this is a paper that shows you, this schematic really just shows you how complex looking at life cycle analysis or greenhouse gas emissions can be. You really have to be painstaking in how you analyze this and really what you think about in terms of the boundaries of your analysis. Where do you stop the analysis? It certainly doesn't stop just in the laboratory. It has to take into account consumable manufacturing, delivery, and reusing them or recycling them in some way. So when this was done, we look at that 1 jar equates to about 280 grams of CO2 emissions. There's no economies of scale. Every jar you send, every pot you send incurs the same amount of CO2. And those 3 jars are equivalent to around 2 miles driven in a passenger car. So if you extrapolate that, let's say, to the US, that's equivalent to yearly greenhouse emissions from around 3,400 passenger cars. So huge footprints that we could potentially think about reducing. And how? Well, we've got support. We've got support from national societies already to tell us when to take biopsies, when not to do an endoscopy in the first place, because the greatest waste, I think, and we've all been there, is looking at a patient in front of you and saying, listen, I can't justify this endoscopy. The greatest waste is a procedure that did not need to be performed in the first place. But we can't end there by saying, well, we'll just triage more effectively. We have to do other things. So hopefully the items that I've highlighted to you today can give you that impetus. So in summary, the carbon footprint of endoscopy is being worked out, but it's an exact science and it's also an exacting science. It could have global impact, but it also there is also going to be significant global variation too, because of energy usage and where energy comes from. It could shift the balance considerably in life cycle analysis. So could we extrapolate? Well, even without waiting for the data, there's plenty of things we can do right now to reduce our carbon footprint. I've shown you the quick wins that you can make on waste management, on paper usage, on water usage, on energy, if you get your energy from renewable sources, and reducing or minimizing the number of biopsies that you send and how you send them. There are national and international guidelines to guide us in sustainability. And obviously, there's always Green Endoscopy on Twitter. There are other healthcare organizations involved in the climate crisis and have skin in the game and have multiple sources and resources for people to learn and educate themselves on how we can become more sustainable as a division, as a specialty. And I'd just like to end by thanking all of my colleagues in the Green Endoscopy group, Shuan Thomas Gibson from St. Mark's, Francis Mortimer from the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, and Nick Willis from Imperial College, and last but not least, our fellow, who's the first fellow in Sustainable Endoscopy, Robin Badley, who's done a lot of the work that underpins this. To close then, Mr. Chairman, endoscopy needs to reinvent itself for a sustainable future, and fast. Doing less, doing better, doing more appropriate has never been more important, but there are other things that we need to do. You can make small changes in your hospitals. You can record the data, tell us about it, publicize, tell others about it. We cannot simply go back to how we were doing business as usual pre-COVID. Our planet needs us to change, and first do no harm has to also include the planet. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. That was very inspiring. So I just want to remind all the participants to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any questions, that function will allow you to submit questions that we can then answer during our Q&A portion, which will be moderated soon. But I want to now introduce a very special colleague of mine, Dr. Heiko Pohl, who will be presenting on the carbon footprint of non-endoscopy digestive care.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk on the carbon footprint of non-endoscopy digestive care. I'd like to start unconventionally with showing you a painting of the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. I invite you to take a moment and look at this painting and notice what's happening within you. What kind of sensations or emotions does this painting bring up within you? The beauty of a painting or any piece of art cannot be described in words alone. There's something beyond the rational description of, let's say, the color or the dimension of a painting. Something that invokes a subtle emotion and that invites us to participate in the experience of the painting, not intellectually with our minds, but with our hearts. As physicians, we call this type of participating in the experience empathy. Which I think is well shown in this painting, The Doctor by Luke Files. Again, please take a moment to look at the painting and notice what's happening within you. You might have. So why do I show you these paintings? I think when we're trying to deal with climate change and environmental destruction, things may often seem very abstract to us. And the idea of participatory knowing goes back to Aristotle. To fully grasp and know something requires us to experience it beyond the pure rational knowing. And such participating in the experience also fuels our motivation to do something. When we hear about wildfires or droughts, tornadoes or landslides, famines and refugees, these facts may become tangible to us if we allow ourselves to participate in the experience, which requires a moment of silence and reflection. For me personally, seeing the waste that we generate in our endoscopy unit every day has been the inciting event that inspired me to do something. With this experiential introduction, I will now proceed to the formal presentation and try to address the following two main questions. First, what are the sources of carbon emission in our non-endoscopic GI hepatology practice? And second, I will try to answer the questions of what we can do to reduce our carbon footprint. As I mentioned previously, the healthcare sector is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and thereby to global warming. So what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions within the healthcare sector? The Greenhouse Gas Protocol distinguishes three different sources of emissions, Scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 includes all direct emissions that are coming from direct emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, for instance, from burning fossil fuels. And within the hospital, it would be, for instance, through the release of anesthetic gases. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that are generated from producing electricity. So they include all our electricity needs. It is interesting to note that the majority, 70 to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions within the healthcare sector come from Scope 3 emissions. And the biggest component of Scope 3 emissions are actually the supply chain. In other words, specialties that require a lot of equipment and supplies are probably the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And within GI and hepatology, it is performing endoscopic procedures. But you can also see that pharmaceuticals or medications are a major component, as is travel related to patient and staff transportation. So this just highlights that emissions are not just about endoscopic procedures, but are generated in all areas of our GI and hepatology practice. So how do we in GI and hepatology contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? We see patients in clinical practice either in the hospital or in ambulatory care centers. We order and perform tests and perform procedures, and we treat typically with medications. And of course, these services require a building that we work in. It requires an infrastructure, electricity, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. And we also need to have administrative services, those who schedule our patients, those who assure that we are reimbursed for what we do. And we also pursue educational and research activities. And all this is really independent of our area of practice. May it be general GI, hepatology, esophageal disease, IBS, IBD, or pancreatology. And as a result of our care, we impact the environment, most notably through waste, but also greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide emissions. So if you ask about data on carbon emissions that is specific to non-endoscopic GI hepatology care, my answer is there is none. I did not find a single study that looked at carbon emissions related to testing and treatment outside of the endoscopy unit. But our practice really consists of diagnostic tests and treatment options that are present in all fields of medicine. We order lab tests, we order imaging, we prescribe medications or perform functional testing. And for these clinical activities, we do have some data. So let's look at carbon footprint of lab tests first. I was surprised to find quite a number of publications on that topic, including a guideline that gives recommendations of how to establish green laboratories. This study here from the US is relevant to our practice. It examined the carbon footprint related to taking biopsies. You take either 3 biopsies, put them into 3 jars, or 3 biopsies and put them into 1 jar. And you can see that the reduction in carbon footprint goes down by 63%. At this point, I'd like to briefly pause and say something about interpreting the results of carbon emissions. When you see a carbon emission of 0.79 kilogram, what does it mean? We have no real reference. We may use miles of driving a petrol car or relate the amount to the number of trees that are needed to absorb the carbon that has been emitted over time. For instance, a grown tree can absorb 20 kilograms of carbon per year. But for our purposes, it is more important to understand relative difference between different tests and treatment strategies than to understand the absolute values. So let's look at blood tests. You see here that for full blood test or coagulation test or BUN creatinine, the carbon footprint is fairly similar, about 0.1 kilogram of carbon equivalent for any lab test. So it's relevant to note that even though the absolute number is small, we do perform quite a number of these, and they add up, and they also provide an opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint. All right, let's look at imaging. Again, a number of studies were published on this. The results are what we would expect. An MRI generates a far greater carbon footprint than a CT scan. And a CT scan, a far greater carbon footprint than an ultrasound. In relative terms, using a CT scan instead of an MRI would reduce environmental impact or the carbon footprint by 63%. And getting an ultrasound instead of a CT scan would reduce the carbon footprint by 94%. Those data are coming from Australia, but data from the US are very similar. Please note that the absolute values, for instance, of an MRI is close to 20 kilograms of carbon equivalent compared to 0.1 kilogram of a carbon equivalent, which we have seen for a blood test, so about 200 times greater than a blood test. So these numbers also show the potential for reducing our environmental impact as we can choose alternative yet appropriate imaging tests for some conditions. For instance, for some medications, we may use a CT scan instead of an MRI or an ultrasound instead of a CT scan. For instance, we can use an intestinal ultrasound to assess the disease activity in a patient with inflammatory bowel disease, as you can see here in the images. A practice that has been common in Europe, but has only recently been accepted in the US. So we have an opportunity to choose a test with a lower emission when making decisions on the type of imaging. So what about medications? We know that medications are a major contributor to carbon footprint within the healthcare sector, but it's difficult to estimate the carbon emissions in part because it's difficult to estimate emissions during the development phase of a drug. And therefore, the price of a drug has been used as a surrogate for estimating carbon emissions. This is problematic because price varies between countries and changes over time. So let's take, for instance, omeprazole. In the UK, the carbon footprint of one tablet is 0.1 kilogram. But in the US, it's more expensive. So the estimated carbon footprint is 3 times as much. A similar ratio is seen for adalimumab for inflammatory bowel disease. But overall, the estimated carbon emission for one dose of adalimumab is approximately 1,000 times greater than for one dose of omeprazole. So just for comparison, the carbon footprint of one dose of adalimumab is comparative to a carbon footprint of performing a major surgery. For me, most interesting and astonishing also is the comparison to oil or petrol. So 1 gram of a medication is many-fold greater than, has a many-fold greater carbon emission than 1 gram of oil. So one major question that has come up, and particularly during the time of the pandemic, is the question of telemedicine or virtual clinic visits. So this interesting study from St. Mark's in London has compared in-person visits before the pandemic with virtual clinic visits during the pandemic and looked at emissions, and particularly GI emissions and mortality. And what they found is that the proportion of admissions to the gastroenterology service as expected declined, but interestingly, there was no difference in overall mortality. And this small study is retrospective, but it suggests that virtual care may not automatically lead to worse outcomes. Here's another example of successful telemedicine. This nurse-led study from Australia looked at treatment of hepatitis C patients that lived remotely, and they could engage 67% of all eligible patients to complete hepatitis C treatment, with most of them having a complete response. Again, the study is small, but it suggests that in selective patients, virtual medicine. And finally, this study from Sweden that was published already in 2014 compared usual care visits with virtual visits and found a 40 to 70% reduction in carbon emissions with telemedicine. Not surprisingly, distance of travel and frequency of visits were associated with a reduction in carbon emissions. It is clear that with COVID, virtual clinic visits are here to stay. Telemedicine reduces carbon emissions, and in part due to reduced travel, but perhaps also because of less unnecessary testing. We need to better understand what patients with what conditions can be best cared for by virtual visits and what patients are better seen in person. I also want to mention that telemedicine has the potential to improve access to care for those who live further away or those who cannot afford travel and an in-person doctor visit. I just want to highlight that there are other main areas in which we, within the hospital or a clinic system, can reduce carbon emissions, including renewable energy, green infrastructure, purchasing of supplies and equipment with a lower environmental impact, and we can integrate green sustainability principles into education and research. And we can also follow the 3 R's of reduce, reuse, recycle. And all these different aspects are covered in other lectures, so I will not go into this any further. So where can we start? What can we do to lower our carbon footprint in our practice? I'd like to point out that at the center of our clinical practice, it is us. We as healthcare providers make decisions on who we see, whether we see a patient in person or virtually, what tests we order, and how we treat a patient. And with each decision, we have the opportunity to order tests or choose a treatment option that is less environmentally impactful, yet provides the quality of care that the patient deserves. So probably the greatest environmental benefit comes from avoiding a test or a procedure or a medication that is not needed in the first place. Overdiagnosis and prescribing tests and medications that are not appropriate has been well documented. In fact, up to 50% of tests are not indicated, and we often provide care that is of low value and of questionable benefit to the patient, and can thereby only cause harm to both patient and the environment. For instance, is repeat imaging testing of a pancreas cyst indicated? Do we really need a manometry test or a pH probe for a patient with typical reflux symptoms? Do we need to perform a liver biopsy in every patient with NASH? The interesting point here is that we already have guidance on high quality practice that's also environmentally friendly. If we just adhere to the guidelines that are provided, we would reduce overdiagnosis and inappropriate testing, but also cost, and decrease the impact on the environment. Initiatives as choosing wisely help to lower overdiagnosis and overtreatment. So the first and best thing we can do is trying to adhere to the current guidelines and to reduce low value and inappropriate tests. Next, we can consider alternative test options that are less environmentally impactful. For instance, we can use FIT for colon cancer screening instead of a colonoscopy, which is done in many European countries, but not in the US. We could also use non-invasive H. pylori testing instead of an upper endoscopy. And as mentioned earlier, we can choose an imaging test that is as appropriate, but less environmentally impactful. For instance, using an ultrasound for HCC screening instead of an MRI. There's also a need for research to compare alternative testing and treatment strategies with respect to the environmental and health outcomes. So you can start tomorrow. You can come to work by public transportation, by bike, by car share. You may remember turning off the lights and your equipment before you go home. You may be mindful about water usage, and you may bring your own reusable cup. Most of all, you may include environmental aspects in your decisions, as mentioned earlier, what tests to order, what treatments to apply, and what supplies to use. You can also optimize your use of telemedicine and go paperless and go digital where possible. And if you are enthusiastic about the topic, you may assemble a green team to inspire changes in your hospital. I'd like to point out that every change has been inspired by a human being, by an individual. You have a chance to influence your friends, your colleagues, your family, and people around you. And that may be within your clinical practice, within the hospital, regionally, nationally, or internationally. Wherever you are, you have the opportunity to talk to people and influence them. And by doing so, inspire perhaps a broader change. It's also important to not get overwhelmed by devastating news, but keep a spirit of optimism. You might, for instance, subscribe to this newsletter from the Climate Optimist shared through Harvard School of Public Health. And in that spirit, I'd like to finish with some achievements on the path towards a sustainable GI and hepatology practice. Over the past 2 years, several GI societies have published recommendations for such a path, including ESGE and ESGNA guidance, but also the BSG strategy on climate change and sustainability. Within the US, the Mold Society Task Force has published a 5-year strategic plan that provides a roadmap in all areas of clinical practice, and that includes proposed initiatives and also sets milestones over this 5-year time horizon. In other words, GI practices may use this as a guide to achieve a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and establish a sustainable GI and hepatology practice. A friend recently suggested that the climate crisis is above all the crisis of our relationship to ourselves within nature. How we relate to ourselves as an integral part of nature may be the core towards achieving sustainable living. We are not separate from nature, we are part of it. And to heal that relationship, we need to listen not only to our minds, but our hearts. I'd like to finish with a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. The difference between what we do and what we are capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pohl. That was, again, a very inspiring talk. Definitely will motivate all of the listeners to working on improving sustainability in their respective hospitals and endoscopy centers. So thank you for that. So up next, we're going to have our Q&A portion where we will again have some wonderful moderators asking questions from the audience, from you, the viewers and the listeners. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. Our moderators today again are Dr. Alejandro Piscoya and Dr. Raja Affendi Raja Ali, and they are again coming to us. We have an international panel today. So if everyone can turn your cameras on, next we're going to have our moderators go through the Q&A section. So Dr. Piscoya, if you'd like to start by asking the group the first question from the Q&A box.
Thank you. Sure. This first question is talking about what can you comment on the trend to use CO2 for colonoscopy? How is that better or worse for the climate change?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. The question is about using carbon dioxide insufflation during colonoscopy. Well, it raises a great point about listen, our drive to become more sustainable we shouldn't ignore our patients and published evidence that tells us that something is clinically a good thing to do. Obviously, there's water immersion as well, which let's maybe there's another question about water usage. But in terms of the emissions of using carbon dioxide in the human body, that will be metabolized. So it won't be released into the atmosphere after that. But obviously, carbon dioxide is made, and it requires carbon to be made as a medical gas. So it does incur some footprint, but it's generally a byproduct of the petrochemical industry. So I don't think we need to be worried too much about using CO2, and it's a good thing for patients.
Can I add to this?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So there is one study that looked at this, and the carbon footprint, which is actually interesting because it's one of the scope 1 emissions that we have in endoscopy, direct emissions, is extremely low just from using it. But 99% of the carbon footprint related to using carbon dioxide is coming from producing it. Yeah. And I think in that study, it was specifically produced, and there may be as a byproduct, there may be ways of lower emission of producing carbon dioxide, but just reflects how complex that is. So we using carbon dioxide doesn't really contribute much, but the production of it and the transport before it comes to us, that's a major effect. And there should be some changes made. And of course, we can think about reducing our own use of carbon dioxide, switching off the machines when we're not using the endoscope.
And nitrous oxide, completely different story, but carbon dioxide seems to be okay.
Dr. Pohl, you bring up such a good point. I think as a society and, physicians, clinicians, lay people, all in patients, all included, need to shift their thought process away from, okay, I'm burning gas and that's my mission. It's about the amount of energy it takes to actually create so many of the products that we use, like the sneakers on our feet, the mat we're using to, improve our ergonomics in the unit. Every single thing that you utilize takes a lot of energy to create. And I think that's often one of the invisible footprint aspects that people don't consider. And so I really appreciate that point a lot. So if we can have Dr. Affendi take over the next question from Mary Caniglio.
Okay, thank you, Rabia. Maybe I can ask Dr. Pohl this question here. Can we clarify the requirement or not for sterile water used during the endoscopy cases? So the issue of using the sterile water during endoscopy cases, please.
Yeah. Yes, it's not a short answer, I'm afraid, but basically this is covered in the joint BSG and CSH consensus statements. Essentially, there's a difference between using sterile water in the irrigation channels of your endoscopes versus the biopsy channels, the flushing channels. So you can use water that is the same quality as drinking water through the flushing channels, but there's still some caution or some sensitivity around using it through an irrigation channel. We're working or we're waiting to hear back from some industry about that, but right now you can also use drinking water, quality water, to wipe down your endoscopes before sending them off to be cleaned. So there are ways in which we can reduce the use of sterile water, but it's not entirely straightforward. And there's manufacturers' warranties and things to be taken into account too for the endoscopes themselves. But there are ways in which we can reduce it, and those are covered in those consensus statements.
Thank you, Dr. Pohl. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, that's a hotly debated topic, and we use a lot of sterile water, particularly with colon insufflation, immersion and water techniques. There is no data to support using sterile water over tap water, and so there's no really evidence to support that practice, and there's a movement towards revising it. So I think just imagine, I mean, we drink water, right? We get this to the stomach. So why not using water for the colon? And the idea that we induce an infection by taking a biopsy seems very theoretical. So I think we have to rethink within the environmental perspective what we're doing. So hopefully more to come. There's no, my understanding of the guidelines is that they don't forbid using tap water, but they prefer using sterile water because of the theoretical concern of infection.
So much of our practices, our daily practices, are because we fall under the umbrella of peri-op. And I imagine this goes back to some billing issue back in the day, and throwing us under that umbrella was beneficial for somebody who wasn't necessarily a clinician or boots on the ground. And so I think it's really important for us to, question the status quo and push the envelope in trying to make change. So these are all really great points. So Dr. Piscoya, if you want to take the next question from Harish Gagneja.
Sure, there are a couple of questions on the same issue. A lot of things in the industry are going towards disposable items everywhere, even duodenoscopes that can be disposable now. So what can we do? How can we the leadership within our DI societies act to ensure that these changes are maybe reversed in a way, maybe that the clinicians are going to initiate different changes and maybe go to influence the industry, but also influence the clinicians themselves. How can we do that? Maybe we can start with you, Boo.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so listen, I'm not here as a representative of the BSG, but I know that they're taking a really admirable stance in sustainability and working these issues through for sure, as are the ASGE and the WGO. So I think action is being taken. Yeah, infection control, I think, is the rate limiting step in sustainable healthcare, or is one of the rate limiting steps. So the more questions that we ask, the more times we say, well, why are we doing this? And we don't accept the answer that, well, it's just the way we've always done it, so it's the way we're going to continue. We always ask what we can do differently, and it's a I had more hair a couple of years ago because I've been asking that question repeatedly. Alejandro, I think you have the same issue, it's a slow process, unfortunately slow. But we have to be determined, and we have to carry on asking those questions.
Yeah, since you mentioned infection control, there are some problems in some part of the world where water is not good for drinking, for example. So it may be different from somewhere where you can use water instead of tap water instead of stir water, but some other places you probably would not use tap water because it's not drinkable. What do you think, Heiko?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you were just saying. So it can be filtered though, or it has to be drinkable water. Maybe I just also add a comment to the industry question and the disposable versus reusable instruments. It's interesting. There was a recent on stage conversation that I had with industry partners as part of the AGA Tech CGIT meeting, and they really promoted their switching to renewable energy during manufacturing process, and thereby lowering carbon footprint, which is wonderful, which is really great, and I wish hospitals would do that. But then I think they don't see what we see. We you know, the pile of trash that we produce every day from the things that we use once and throw away. Just imagine, produced somewhere in the world, shipped all the way with packaging. We unpack it, we use it once, and then we throw it away. It just doesn't seem to make sense. So I think there has to be first communication. It has to be both sides working together, and some understanding of what our perspective is and what their perspective is. And then there has to be some kind of rethinking in terms of environmental design. We are ingenious as a human race. We can come up with new things, you know, handles that are perhaps compostable, or tips that can be reused or so. So I think we just have to take that perspective in redesigning what we're using, and we can come up with a solution. But the other thing that I was told by the partners, the industry partners, was that there has to be demand for this. So our societies, and we as the ones that consume it or take it, we have to have a clear stance on, we want to have reusable things. We don't want to have disposable single-use stuff. And then they might change what they're doing. But it's a combined process, I believe.
So if Dr. Affendi wants to take the next question from Jennifer Gilbert regarding diet and food.
Hi, Rabia. I can't see the diet questions around here, but
I'm happy to
so there's a question here. Are oxygen concentrator better than pipe oxygen during sedation? Can we get a comment on that, Bu and Heiko?
I did not understand that question.
The question was, are oxygen concentrators better than pipe oxygen during sedation as opposed to reduce all this CO2 emission?
I don't know.
Yeah, simple answer. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, in principle, you would think maybe because piped any gas leaks. Hospitals have aging infrastructure, and if gases leak, then it's a waste. But to have kind of standing cylinders that you would use instead of piped oxygen, I think makes some sense. But I'm not aware of any data for oxygen per se. Nitrous oxide for sure, but not oxygen.
Sure. I just give to the next question here. I can read here. Can you comment on the use of the non-sterile gloves in endoscopy? Is there any recommendation to use biodegradable gloves such as the bionitrile glove? Thank you.
Again, no, it's a great point, and it just shows you how many ideas, when you get people in a room, how many ideas come through. I think it's exciting. One of the ways in which we combat infection control policy, if you like, is with data. So I would encourage anyone listening, if you have an idea, is to get out there and generate the data for us. I think that would be amazing. I think in practice and in principle, I think biodegradable anything isn't necessarily better than what we have right now. What we need to focus on is reduce and reuse and recycle. So maybe with the plastic, it's reduce. And so instead of using 3 gloves, double gloving, just use a single glove and see if you can get away with that. But other than that, the data needs to be there to inform our practice.
Yeah, I completely agree. There is actually one study that compared sterile gloves with non-sterile gloves, and the carbon footprint was multifold for sterile gloves. Of course, for one glove, it's very low. So it's understandable that if you produce something sterile, that there's probably more energy going into producing it.
Thank you. I'll pass back to Rabia.
Yes, really great point. So perhaps Dr. Piscoya, you can then take the question about diet from Jennifer Gilbert.
Yeah, this question is wondering about the sustainability of a gluten-free diet.
Wow.
Is there any alternative with new dietary solutions?
I like that question. It's very complex.
Yeah.
So the question is, where's our food coming from, right? And so we know that meat-based diet is a much greater contributor to carbon footprint than a plant-based diet. So a gluten-free diet may be a meat-based diet, and that's probably a higher carbon footprint. It could be a plant-based diet, then we don't know. But there's also a lot of processing going into producing gluten-free stuff. Diet. But it's interesting, just the dietary aspect, which is a major component in greenhouse gas emissions.
Any comment there?
Oh wow, yeah, not necessarily my area of expertise, but yeah, I mean, listen, it's a good question, and it kind of highlights the complexities of what we're talking about in terms of it's not just about an item, it's about the impact of that item on the environment. So I would agree broadly with Heiko that listen, plant-based, but not exclusively plant-based, is probably the way forward. There is some data to say that an exclusively vegan diet is more impactful than say a broad vegetarian diet or a pescatarian diet. But it depends on where you get your food, how it's made, how the fish are extracted from the oceans. So yeah, it's complex.
There's maybe one more aspect that's this question is touching on, which is what is sustainability? It's not just lowering the environmental impact directly to things. It's also the way of how we live, and it seems like prevention of disease or through healthy living, self-motivating are also pillars of sustainability, and those are cultural aspects. And some argue that if we address that, if we all could have a healthier way of living, preventing chronic diseases, the impact of our healthcare sector, healthcare industry on the environment, which would be far less.
I think that's a very positive, uplifting, and motivating note to end on. I want to thank our speakers and our moderators for really wonderful presentations and discussion. This has been really wonderful. I think everyone who's listening will agree with me that I feel more educated and more motivated to make some positive change after listening to this talk. So I just want to remind everyone, this is a bi-weekly webinar series, and the next one is session 6, Greening Endoscopy and Reducing Waste, and that will take place on May 17th. So please join us for that as well. And we just want to give again a wholehearted thank you to everyone. for joining us. And a recording of this webinar will be available on the WGO's website, and an email with link will be sent to all registrants. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thank you.
Very much, everyone.